Welcome to The Wing, the emotional and financial health check you never knew you needed. We provide tangible solutions for young women to build emotional health and wealth on their journey from school to motherhood. This is the podcast for young women in Australia navigating the big stuff: life, money, and motherhood. From high school to first homes, babies to bank accounts, we take you on an interactive listening journey that helps you make smart, empowered decisions every step of the way.
Hello, ladies, and welcome to The Wing. Today's episode is going to be a pretty personal but a very useful one, especially for you ladies out there that might struggle with a bit of OCD, or you might have certain standards that you want yourself and the people around you to live up to. So I'll probably start by framing this with a little bit of a jig on self-care. Now, if you don't have one of these, you need to get one, a self-care journal. Katey makes absolutely stunning ones. I had been gifted one actually from a friend of mine, and I had been paying that forward by purchasing quite a few and then passing them on to friends that I thought to be in need of some self-care and some journaling, because I think that journaling is a form of self-care. There's a beautiful page in the one that I've got, and I've got the page highlighted. I actually had it dated in June 24. But I'm going to read you this part of the book because this will sort of frame why it's so important to invest in self-care and, take the time to understand yourself and prioritize your own thinking and how you might debunk that, and what part of your thinking might be negatively impacting your relationship, your friendships, or any relationships really, or with anybody that you interact with in your life. So to begin with, it is time to start looking after yourself and show yourself some kindness. Imagine a world where you were your own best friend, a world where you treated yourself kindly, compassionately, and made time for all the things you love and need. Imagine speaking to yourself like you do your loved ones, and imagine having more energy and zest for life because you allowed yourself to rest, recharge, and do more of what you enjoy. This world is possible. All it takes is a conscious decision to embrace more self-care in your everyday. And if you're reading this, then you've already taken the first step by picking up this journal. So there you go, ladies. You've completed step number 1. Self-care is more than just a popular catchphrase or a trending Instagram hashtag. However, the reason this practice is getting so much airtime is because it's more important now as our lives get busier and busier and more technology driven than ever before. Self-care doesn't have to take a lot of work or a lot of time. In fact, all it really takes is for you to make the short choice to begin looking after yourself, to ensure you're putting yourself first, and to start making time for whatever it is you need to be the best version of yourself. After all, if you don't look after yourself, who will? Now, that's the frame, all right? So that's what we're going to be talking about now, and I'm going to share something that I learned as part of my self-care journey. I have been seeing my psychologist for as long as I can remember. I've seen different psychologists along the way, depending at what phase I am in my life and what problem or situation I'm trying to navigate. I believe that there are, horses for courses, and choosing a psychologist is a very personal thing. A lot of psychology websites or EAP platforms or similar will give you a list and profile on the different types of psychologists you can seek help from. The way I went about it was that, and look, I still think this is quite an arduous process. I don't believe that it is as easily as accessible as it should be, because there are a number of costs along the way, but there are also some cost saves along the way. So we'll talk about those too. So I went to my GP most recently, when I went to my GP for my 6-week postnatal checkup with our daughter a couple of years ago. I obviously went through and did for any mums out there that have done this checkup, they do actually check on you as well. So you will know that and will have gone through that check yourself. I was probably putting on a brave face for most of it. We booked the appointment at 8 o'clock in the morning. I'm not entirely sure why we did that, but our GP was very impressed that we got there on time and in order by that time. I think I was used to booking early appointments for work and, being the first cab off the rank, so the day started fresh and in a good way. But when you're a new parent, that's not really the most practical way to look at things. So I get to the appointment and I had spoken to the GP about different medication options for anxiety because by this stage, this 6-week postpartum period, I had noticed my OCD going absolutely off the charts. Now, we had moved into a new home, so there was a number of new processes and new, areas of the house and, a bit of a jobs list to coordinate that we weren't as a couple necessarily familiar with. Obviously, we were also navigating a new baby, which we hadn't done before. So there was a lot of change that had happened in a short space of time. We only moved into the home 2 weeks before our daughter was born. So in that 8-week period when I was meeting with the GP, so many huge changes had occurred. So my brain is just going into complete overdrive to try and maintain a neat and tidy house because that's what I need to function properly. I need clear, mindful spaces so that I don't have a cluttered mind. I addressed that with the GP and she recommended Zoloft. So it's an antidepressant, anti-anxiety medication, which I tried for 13 days and it was the worst 13 days of my life. I had every symptom that was written on the box. I understood that moving through those symptoms is where you really get the benefit by moving through the symptoms and, giving it the 6 to 8 weeks to settle into your system so that you're able to, function better as a result of taking the medication. I, however, decided to bail out and not continue the medication after the 13 days because I just was emotionally, mentally, physically completely depleted, and it just wasn't for me. So that, as part of that meeting as well, so that was one of the outcomes that happened. The other part was we did a mental health plan. So when you do a mental health plan, you fill out a questionnaire and you get ranked based on your answers by the GP as to what, it's obviously a formula that's all worked out properly. And you fall into different categories, whether you kind of qualify to see a psychologist. I went through that. That's a very brief overview, by the way. If you are thinking about getting a mental health plan, book straight in with your GP and get them to run you through it. You will have to do it in person. I don't know that you can do those on telehealth, but I highly recommend going through at least that part of the process because some of the questions in there can be quite confronting to answer, and you're sort of sitting in the doctor's office answering them freestyle as the doctor's sitting there waiting for your results and then, tallying it all up and telling you what you're going to do next. So I did that plan. I got the plan. Now, what the plan does is gives you a rebate off psychology services so that you're not paying full freight for the appointments. Now, I'm not going to lie, the appointments are still not on the cheap side, and every psychologist office will be different. But the way I saw it was that, well, if I'm going to, invest in some nice cushions for our new couch, or I'm going to invest in a rug for our daughter's room, or I'm going to invest in a nice bottle of wine for Jake and I, then I think I can invest in some support that's going to improve my mental health, help me understand me better and others. That's sort of the nice flow on effect, and be set up for this phase in my life so that I'm able to navigate situations in a more tactful and productive way. So after I'd done that plan, I did go and book back in with the psychologist, and I've been on and off seeing her ever since. Yeah, as I said, I swapped to a couple of different psychologists, mostly just to do with availability, but I do read their profiles and, see who might be aligned with me in my journey at the particular time that I'm looking. If there's something in my mind that I just cannot debunk, and it doesn't matter how many conversations I have with friends or family, I just can't get my head around, it's I could vent and I can rant and I can write, but when you don't fully understand something, you can't actually debunk it properly for a long-term effect. So that's why I sought this help. Now, I won't tell you about every single psychology session I've had because we'll be here all year. But what I do, the most interesting thing that I found out of my psychology, one of my more recent psychology appointments, we went through and I said, I go in prepared with questions, which I also highly recommend. I went in and I said, I want to understand childhood trauma. I keep hearing about it. I keep reading about it. I keep hearing that everybody has it in some way or another. My words of my psychologist were actually that the trauma word is kind of almost overused, and that can turn people off the topic and not actually want to go any further. Now, the reason I was looking at this was because now that I have kids, I want to know what can I do as a parent to avoid them having childhood trauma, or if they're going to have it inevitably anyway, then how do I minimize what that trauma actually is? Obviously, aside from the obvious things like living in a safe environment and having clean clothes and eating fresh food and consuming fresh water, aside from the basics, what else can we be doing for their mental health and growth to, anything that happened to Jake or I when we were kids, big or small, how do we know what those triggers are or what those scenarios are and then avoid them being passed on to future generations? So how do we stop that cycle? So what we went through then was it was an assessment powered by NovoPsych, so I'll quote that, and it was the maladaptive schema scale, young schema aligned. So that was an actual technical term from me blurting out, what's childhood trauma? Do I have it? How do I fix it? And how do I not give it to my kids? So this is what we came back with. I did a test, basically, and there was about 76 questions that I completed online. They're all very random, seemingly random questions. Obviously they weren't, because these are designed by psychologists and, heavily backed by science. So some of the things that I got asked would be around the topics of abandonment, anxious attachment. Oh, that was another thing. I was asking about attachment theories and attachment styles. So childhood trauma, attachment styles, how do they come together? What are we looking at here? So, and I'd done some Googling on attachment styles, and, they're pretty easy to understand if you do look them up, but then you can kind of self-diagnose and figure out which one you might be. But it was also really nice to do this detailed test that sort of pulls out all of these schemas and then tells you what is your clinically meaningful result. And then ultimately being aware of that, probably telling your partner that, like I did. And I can tell you, Jake was smiling so much when I read him this, because he felt very validated in my journey to further my self-awareness. Back to the schemas, so the topics, around abandonment and anxious attachment, mistrust of others, social isolation, defectiveness and shame, dependence, vulnerability to a dangerous world, low self-efficacy or weakness, self-sacrifice, approval seeking, excessive need to be liked, emotional inhibition, pessimism or negativity, unrelenting standards, punitiveness, unforgiving of self, unforgiving of others, entitlement or specialness. Now, that's not all of them. That is me skimming over the detailed list, but those are sort of the topics that the test covered to give me a score and then to tell me what's wrong with me. No, to give me a clinical answer on, okay, well, why am I thinking in these ways and what can I do to navigate them or make the people around me aware of them so that I can sort of be pulled up, I guess, on my behavioral comments or, just having that awareness, because I think awareness is half the thing. It doesn't really matter what your thing is. If you're aware of it, then you're less likely to pass it on to someone else or project it onto someone else or internalize it and be completely unforgiving of yourself and just eat yourself alive with negative self-talk. Now, then it sort of spits out what your needs are. So ranked in order in terms of the thing I need the least to the thing I need the most. So the thing I need the least was safety and attachment, followed by autonomy, competence and identity, followed by freedom to express needs, opinions and emotions, as I speak on a podcast, spontaneity and play. And the biggest need that I have is realistic and consistent limits. Now, that to me initially was quite surprising, because I thought, I'm pretty relaxed. I don't mind if things change that much. I can kind of go with the flow. No, wrong. The more and more I read about the detail in this, the more and more I thought, oh, no, this is right. That was the needs sort of component. Now, the reason I'm going through all of this as well is to just give you an idea on what a process like this could actually dig out for you. If you can identify these things early in your life, then you're going to be able to set yourself up for clearer communication with your parents, with your grandparents, with your partner, with your friends, and with your kids, to be able to understand what you say has a huge impact on others, rather than, there's always moments where we might be flustered or we snap or we go into the silent treatment, or, we all have emotional reactions to situations, which is completely natural. But being able to spot a situation and then step out of it and just kind of look at it and be like, right, so my instinct is to snap with anger, or my instinct is to cry, or my instinct is to abandon, leave, or my instinct is to go quiet, silent treatment. Whatever that is, if you're understanding these details about yourself as a result of speaking with a psychologist and a professional in the mental health space, an hour-long session or two can really add up to a lifetime of better communication and better understanding of yourself and the people around you. And I guarantee you, the people around you are going to thank you greatly for doing this work on yourself. Now, there's a detailed interpretation here of what came up as my most clinically meaningful result. So, my most clinically meaningful result was unrelenting standards. Now, anybody who knows me will know that that is very true. And how this ties into the OCD side of things was fascinating to me, and how I project, absolutely just flat out project these standards onto Jake, not onto our kids. They're too little. They make mess, and that's all right. But as soon as they're in bed for their lunchtime nap, that mess is swiftly cleaned up. Again, for my own headspace. But I don't want to eventually project these unrelenting standards onto my kids, because I probably will by default anyway, but having an awareness around it so that, my need for these standards is not, that may not necessarily be their need. So if I can identify that and not to project my thoughts onto them or my actions, I can demonstrate a clean household and demonstrate a neat and tidy lifestyle. But if that's something that just doesn't go with their grain, then I can't blame them or expect them to, abide by my expectations if it's something so trivial like, not having too many magnets on the fridge, or turning the towel labels around so they face out, or, moving things on certain angles. Like, I could go on, and I'm not going to, because I have covered off on my list of things that go on in a house in 24 hours, which I kindly shared with Jake, so that Jake is aware of all my unrelenting standards, evidently. The gap between writing that list and finding out about my unrelenting standards was about 2 years. So poor Jake has been in a torture chamber for that amount of time. But now he has complete validation on all of his feedback and things that he was thinking about why I'm asking for these ridiculous things. So the unrelenting standards schema includes the belief that one must always pursue very high internalized standards of behavior, performance, and achievement. Now, I'm probably less so the performance and achievement side of things, but standards of behavior. So, and for me, behavior is cleanliness and timeliness. For me, tardiness is one of the biggest insults. And one of the things that I would personally not do to others, unless it was by complete out of my hands, that I just don't find any excuse for it. So, and I suppose that builds into this psychology review. Striving to meet the expectations typically results in feelings of pressure. People with this schema tend to be hypercritical of themselves and may also project their high expectations onto and criticize others. Now, I had highlighted that bit as my psychologist was going through this with me, because that's exactly what I was doing. I was projecting my high expectations onto Jake and then criticizing. So I would say, all right, Jake, you able to take the bins out and wipe down the bench? This was back in the time when we had the new house and we didn't really have a rhythm on who does what and what needs to happen each day and la la la. So Jake would do that, and he'd wipe the bench his way, and I'd come in and I would passively aggressively go and pick up the Dettol spray bottle, and I would go and wipe it again because I could see streak marks, or that he hadn't fully gone all the way to the corners, or whatever ridiculous thing it was that I was micromanaging. To now, when those are things that he does and he does them how he does them, and I need to be okay with the fact that, and I'm not, this is a really terrible example. Jake wipes the bench just fine, but if there's a case where I think, I miss a spot, well, keep that to yourself, Katey. That is not something that needs to be, I don't need to communicate every little thought. And it's actually helping me take my foot off the accelerator a little bit and just think, okay, well, if the bench isn't wiped to the corners, what impact does that have on anything aside from maybe a little bit of my mental health and a little bit of my headspace? But if I can walk away from silly situations like that, not get worked up and put it in the bucket of 1,000 things I'm going to bring up with Jake in 12 months' time, then that's going to give me the ability to just move on with things and focus on what's really important instead. Unrelenting standards typically present as an excessive attention to detail. rewind and just listen to that bit again. Characteristics of perfectionism or selective attention to mistakes and an underestimation of performance. So again, this I believe is relevant because I know a lot of people and a lot of women out there probably struggling with OCD and not understanding the impact that it's actually having on them and also the people around them. So I think, and I'm not saying that I'm obviously not here to diagnose anybody else, but if I share with you what I was diagnosed with through my psychologist and the information that I learned and that I found out, then perhaps this would be a useful exercise for you to go through with your own psychologist or your own health professional so that you can help debunk and manage more something that's innate within you that you just can't just turn off, nor should you have to, but help you communicate better around it. People with this schema often have rigid rules across different areas of life, including unrealistically high work ambitions or ethical expectations. They may believe their worthiness is based on a high level of accomplishment and therefore have fragile self esteem and find it difficult to slow down, relax, or spend time on pleasurable activities. They can be a fear of failure or chronic dissatisfaction about achievements and a tendency to sacrifice personal health, relationships, or leisure in the pursuit of productivity. This can lead to stress, burnout, health issues, and strained relationships. I have experienced every single one of those things in the past. I would say that this in itself is probably been the demise of past relationships because I was unable to recognize this within myself. And if someone wasn't meeting my standards, then to me it was, well, you don't meet that, then that's it. Obviously, over time, I'm not going to break up with somebody over a bench wipe, but I need to. If I had to learn about this when I was 20, I wonder how many things would have flown on, throughout my 20s that would have helped me navigate this in a more positive and productive way rather than just getting stressed, burning out, having health issues or strained relationships, which, as I said, I had every single one of those. Now, there's examples of what maintains this particular schema of unrelenting standards. So the cognitive bias often maintains unrelenting standards via selective attention to mistakes and conversely dismissing, minimizing, or underestimating achievements. I found that bit a bit hard because I don't think I underestimate achievements, but I definitely have a selective attention to mistakes. So this is something I need to be extremely aware of when it comes to our kids because, as you know, if you have kids or if you're around kids at all, kids make a lot of mistakes. I don't think I could even count them on all my fingers and toes in a day how many mistakes are made. And I need to make sure, keep this in mind when our kids get older, so that if there are mistakes, that there is always a way to navigate around them rather than to blame or minimize or be negative about those mistakes and that they are just that. They are just mistakes. The schema can also be maintained by having extremely high expectations and goals that leads to a sense of continually falling short. I've definitely experienced that before. Even when I went through the sale of my business, that was a big transition for me. And I had extremely high expectations of it and goals because I'd nurtured this company from nothing to something that someone wanted to buy one day. And my expectations of that entire process were extremely high, as you can imagine. There's also, some financial factors hanging in the balance of all of that as well. So it was a big, big thing. Sometimes I reflect on that whole journey, and there were a multitude of things that went wrong with that deal over time. And there was a lot of things that went right, but there were also a lot of things that went wrong or that I wish I could have had a redo on, or because of the high expectations, I do have that sense of falling short. So, had I have recognized my unrelenting standards during a time like that, where it was absolutely critical for me to have high attention to detail and not to criticize others and to not stress, burn out, and have strained relationships, I basically did all of those wrong. I'm going to call them wrong things because now I can see the light and I believe that the way I'd handled the situation in certain ways, could have been better. So then you've got productivity or achievement based on media such as books or interviews with high achievers may be consumed excessively. I probably wouldn't fall into the excessive category, but I definitely lean to books and interviews with high performers because I feel like those books provide insight that I wouldn't usually be exposed to, and I do find them helpful. And I'm not going to exclude that because I do think that and I'm going to be recommending some. I literally have a book called, which is probably the first book I've finished cover to cover, aside from Save Our Sleep. But you don't have to read Save Our Sleep cover to cover. You just have to read it chapter to chapter based on where you're up to. And I'm not up to all the chapters yet, so because it's based on your child's age. No, the book I have read cover to cover was The Mindful High Performer by Chelsea Pottinger. She spoke at Jake's work at a Ray White all hands meeting, and that was when I was actually just in dire straits after having our son. My postnatal depression this time, anxiety was fine. Anxiety seemed to take a little back seat, and depression came right on forward. And I was just crying out to Jake, like, I need help. Like, I can't get in with my psychologist quick enough. I can't leave the kids. I can't even get into a doctor's appointment. I was just a mess. Anyway, he ended up getting me onto their workplace EAP, and I spoke with a counselor, quick smart. I couldn't even handle the fact that I tried to call them myself and the phone didn't go through, or a man on the other end didn't answer my question correctly, and I just burst into tears. And Jake, I just can't. These people don't even want to talk to me. No one wants to help me. Like, that's how it was getting bad. Anyway, he just had this guest speaker at their all hands meeting, and he had picked me up a copy of her book, and I had been reading it ever since. I'd since bought another 5 copies off Amazon for Chelsea Pottinger's book, and have passed it on to some other women, soon to be mums, friends, have a mixture of people in my network that I believe would benefit from the book. And it absolutely had helped so much, from reading about Chelsea's story and about where she'd been and where she's going. And, she owns a huge coaching business called EQ Minds and is a worldwide dominator, but went through some awful times postnatal and then was able to document it accurately in her book. So it made me feel like I wasn't alone, and I was able to look to her as a high achiever and look to improve skills and reinforce the expectation of extremely high standards, because that's what I felt like I'd lost during that postnatal period. If I got up in the morning and I didn't make the bed, that to me is an internal failure, because I pride myself on it. That's how I start my day. It's not a big deal, but if it's a small job and that's the thing I get done first off the bat each day, then I've started the day with a small accomplishment. Little things like that got taken away from me in that postnatal recovery period after a C-section with our son. It wasn't just that. It was obviously the physical stress, the mental stress, the emotional stress, the had our daughter as well. So there was 6 weeks where I couldn't pick her up or, do much with her. And there's only 12 months between our 2 kids. So she wasn't quite walking yet. So I'd spent every single day with her for her whole life to date. And then all of a sudden I disappeared for 6 weeks. So the emotional and mental toll I had in shifting my attention onto a new baby, but feeling like my body had been pulled apart and, put back together, just it went against all of my unrelenting standards. So my internal grief and depression and, mental load was just through the absolute roof, because I wasn't able to control any of that. It was a waiting game. I had to wait until I could walk 10 minutes around our street and back. I had to wait until I could lift one or both of the kids into the car to go and visit my parents. The tasks that seemed so small and simple to me before became giant mountains and from these tiny little molehills. Jake and I were actually having one of those walks around the block and one day, and he was telling me about how he had all these huge goals, and like, Jake's a high achiever. He's got a lot of big goals, and was talking me through those on his walk, and like what his new financial year's going to look like, and what his goals are and everything like that. And then I just started, he said, "And what are yours, Dal? Like, tell me about what you're thinking." And I just thought to myself, I thought, my goal is to exactly that: pick up 2 kids, put them in the car, take them to my parents' house. Like, just do something that I used to do regularly. Like, just do it once. Put both kids in the pram and go and walk around the block. Get under a certain weight and stay there. Start walking again regularly for fitness purposes. So, all these tiny little things that I couldn't do any of them. So that's just triggering my unrelenting standards, in all sorts of ways, and I wasn't able to mentally debunk that at the time. And it took me a long time to then obviously then to even go to the psychologist, well, I had to go back and redo my mental health care plan because they expire after 12 months or after 10 sessions or 12 sessions. I'm not sure. Anyway, mine had expired. So, I'm waiting for that next doctor's appointment. So I think I waited for my next 6-week check after our son and did one then. And then you got to book in for the psychologist to get back in there. And I've got to have the kids minded while I do that and, prioritize that time for that version of self-care. And then get to the psychologist's office and hope that that's a day where I feel like being really open and really clear on all the things I'm trying to debunk. And when I could barely get the sentence out that said, I just can't believe that I had a cesarean, which to me now seems so silly. But at the time, I could barely get that sentence out without crying, and I was sobbing through that first appointment back that I had with my psychologist. So, the ways that it can just throw you can be, but the postpartum period can just be horrendous. And I know that anybody listening to this who's been through a postpartum period will perhaps be able to relate to some of these feelings. Now, the possible origins of this schema, and this is where the childhood trauma comes into play. And I really don't like saying that because I don't want to disrespect my lovely parents in any way because I just don't. But it mentions things like the child needs to meet high expectations. See, I don't believe that, but maybe that was my perception of, I do remember always wanting to impress my parents. So perhaps those were some high expectations that I'd set upon myself in those early phases. I also wanted to impress my teachers. I was the one sitting at the front of the class. I was the one in the computer lab, do they have those anymore? Computer lab at high school at lunchtime, studying my little butt off so that I could get onto the principal's recommendation scheme to go to uni in the end after all of that. Yeah, it was that part of it. And then the failure to meet those high expectations again. Were they put on myself? Were they high expectations of my teachers or of my parents? I don't know. My perception is my perception. My perception is that I wanted that feeling of gratification and validation, and the way to get that is to exceed expectations and operate in that level. But what maybe living in that level for so long growing up and wanting to, win every award and be what was I in primary school? School captain, all that type of stuff like that. That was just within me. That was just something that I just wanted to do. But perhaps spending all that time focusing on that is what's been my undoing as an adult, or particularly as a young adult, and not realizing that I've actually created this unrelenting standard situation that had been controlling me for such a long period of time. There's definitely a lot to learn about yourself, and there's so many things that you could go into more and more detail on. I could literally go back with this summary. It's like a 10-page document actually, back to my psychologist and now go and debrief and debunk every single point. So one of the follow-on scores in here are the 6 early childhood needs, and then they give you scores against each of them. So that's one of them is safety and attachment. The next one is autonomy and competence. The next one is freedom to express needs, opinions, and emotions. Then there's self-sacrifice. Then there's spontaneity and play. Then there's realistic and consistent limits. So that was the category that I fell into, the last one. So I could quite easily go back and have 5 other sessions. Okay, we've talked about unrelenting standards and how that's impacted me, but let's go back and talk about the other 5 things that, are factored into my early childhood needs. So, and perhaps that is an exercise I may go through purely out of interest, but also so that these are things that I can look out for in my own kids. And, if they are struggling with certain things or they have certain attachment styles, then I can sort of mold my parenting to support them. And I think a lot of that comes naturally. Obviously, my parents weren't aware of this, and I don't know how new this, information and research actually is, or if it has been around for 100 years, but it's not something that you typically would sit down and go, right, let's study Katey and let's just see exactly what she's after in this life. And let's try and debunk that when she's 2, when she's 6, when she's 12, when she's 15. Kids change so much and there's never a one size fits all. So I just, that's not necessarily a realistic way to go about it. But I think that if we as parents and as adults and as young women are able to, at the very least, know more about ourselves, then we're able to learn how we can communicate with the people around us in a more effective way, no matter who those people are, whether that's your colleagues, your friends, your relationships, with, as I said, parents, friends, colleagues, whoever it may be with, and then also be able to spot varying traits, which would actually come naturally to you anyway as a parent, I feel, in your children. So, clearly, my parents were observing me and they knew that I needed to be outside and I needed to be around people and I needed to have freedom of choice when it came to work and school and friends and boyfriends and whatever else, and were doing everything they could to allow those things to happen for me in a safe environment and in a safe way. So making sure that if I can be more aware of what my requirements actually are, then it's likely that I have already passed them on to my kids, or I will do that at some stage. But doing it in a healthy way that's not so prohibiting like it was to me, particularly in the postnatal periods, and the pressure that it put on my relationship with Jake and making him feel a certain way because my expectations were at a certain level they were not Jake's expectations. So for him to try and fit in that box was a lot of the time he would question why, and I don't blame him because he's going, I just don't know why it matters. Like, why does it matter that, the labels of the towels face out so we can see them when we walk in the bathroom? Why does it matter that candle is on that particular angle? Or why does it matter that we wipe the bench all the way to the corners, even if the corners aren't dirty? Like, I think he spent a lot of time questioning and just wondering. But now we know. So that's the good bit. Now, that's one example of one of the many conversations I've had with my psychologist over time, and I will continue to see a psychologist. I don't believe that psychology sessions are something, I mean, you can do them as a one off, but for me, I didn't believe that it was something where I would just go and say, right, here are all my issues. These are the things that are bothering me and the people around me. How do I fix them? And then learn about that and go, right, I'm fixed. I'm done. That's it. I think because life throws you so many different things at so many different stages and you react and respond in different ways throughout those phases, that it's valid to continually check in with a psychologist if it is within your means and is within your bandwidth to go ahead and have those conversations at the time that these situations are coming up, because you're able to deal with them in the moment rather than stew on them, sit on them, forget about them, and then they might come up again in 5 years. If you can try and nip things in the bud as you go, then maybe we'll all have a better chance of understanding ourselves and understanding others and having clearer communication and having better relationships and ultimately creating better environments for our kids to succeed in, particularly at home. Now, I hope that's been helpful, and I hope that at the very least is a little reminder to go ahead and do some self care, or maybe you could write down what your self care is. Maybe everybody has different methods of self care. I wrote down mine. Mine are things like a hot bath, hot tea. My theme is actually hot stuff. Hot weather, sauna. I'm just kidding. I'm focusing on those things. But making the bed, that's on my list. A massage. Talking to mum, that's a nice one. Getting good sleep. The kids sleeping. Seeing the kids happy. Spending one-on-one time with Jake. Cooking. Journaling, laughing, colouring in. I love colouring in. We might talk about that when I talk about anxiety in a separate episode. Silent time alone, watching my shows. Oh, I like cold weather too. That's good. That was something else I wrote. Anyway, these are all things that I incorporate into my self-care. And sometimes if I'm feeling a bit scattered or a bit lost, I might just even go and open up my self-care journal and just go, what did I write? Well, I wrote something good in here. I know I did. And just go back and read a few entries. It's really interesting to watch yourself progress. Like I said, when I went back and I looked at those notes from June 24 about my list on the goals I was trying to achieve with the kids and with my physical ability, and I look at those things now. I read the whole list out to Jake the other night, and I said I would do all those things in one weekend now, like without even thinking about it. Those things are just part of my normal routine. But at the time, I could not see through the fog, and I thought I am never going to be able to do any of these things ever again. So anyway, the self-care journal, the self-care approach has certainly worked for me, and I hope to pass on this message of the importance and the role, I suppose, probably more the role of having a psychologist in your corner and liaising with medical professionals that are able to point you in the right direction so that you can attain the right information for your own self-preservation and understanding. Hopefully that was helpful, and I look forward to catching you on the next episode of The Wing.
Enjoyed the episode? Hit follow and check out _wingpod Oz on Instagram for a dose of wisdom getting you on the right path to success.